This is a jug that I first painted 10 years ago, and today I'm going to paint it again 4 times using 4 slightly different techniques. Along the way, I'm going to show you how repeating a subject can improve not just this piece, but every piece you create going forward. I'll show you how revisiting the same subject multiple times can unlock your creativity, build your confidence, and finally help you see the progress that you've been chasing. Perhaps you had those moments where you look at another artist's work and wonder, how are you getting it so right? Why can't I seem to make that same progress? And the thing is, it's not because of a lack of talent or ability. It's often because of how you are practicing. I see it all the time. Students sketch something out once and move on, thinking that's how they will improve. But what if the key isn't moving on, but staying with the subject for a little bit longer, repeating it, exploring it, and discovering things you didn't even realize were there? Today, I'm going to show you how repeating a subject several times, not just once, but 4 times, can completely change the way you paint, sketch, and approach your art. I'm going to share how this simple shift in mindset can help you build confidence, refine your skills, and see real progress in a way that feels natural and really rewarding. This is the small Moleskine sketchbook, my second one that I completed, but I started it on summer 2015. So that's 10 years ago, and I thought it would be great if I could recreate one of those first sketches that I ever created, this jug. Back then, I really didn't know what I was doing, so it seems to be hovering on the page. I didn't understand about car shadows. I also really didn't understand about creating depth. This area here isn't too bad, but I think I overworked it. I didn't understand how to create the transparencies. There is a bit of volume there. I think probably I was a bit miffed with myself that I didn't leave enough room for that handle. So 10 years later, I'm going to paint it again. And I still have it. So I'm going to do 4 different versions. One where I use watercolour with pen line, one where I use coloured pencils with watercolour, and another with markers. This is the Hahnemuhle watercolour sketchbook. It is a 5 size cold pressed 200 GSM, and this is the standard sketchbook that I use these days. Just to give you a little bit of context, I am painting in front of my French doors. You can see the light is coming from this side, and this is the angle. So I want to be able to get this depth here and the roundness and the highlight there. Something else that is going to be different from 10 years ago, I would have been using student grade watercolours, and these watercolours are now professional quality, so they're a mixture of Winsor & Newton, Holbein, Daniel Smith, and even some Schmincke. And these days I use a quill brush. This one is by Pro Art. Looking back at this first painting of the jug, I realised how much my perspective and approach have evolved with 10 years worth of watercolour experience. Back then I was so focused on replicating every detail as I saw it, and I was probably very determined to make the jug look as close to this creamy off-white colour as possible. But now my approach is different. For this version, I've given myself the freedom to interpret rather than replicate. Yes, this jug is cream in reality, but since I'm going through a bit of a pink phase, I've decided to let that influence my painting. And you know what? That is absolutely okay. That is my creative choice. My quill brush is creating broad strokes, and they're quite smooth and letting that paint flow naturally. One of the most important lessons I've learned over the years is to focus more on value contrast rather than colour. And the value, the lightness or darkness of an area, is what truly makes a sketch feel dimensional and alive. So while the base colour is light and airy, I have mixed a slightly darker pigment for the inside of the jug, and now we have to let it dry. Just as in the original 10 years ago, I am using a black fine liner. This is by Tombow. And I'm not outlining the entire jug, which looks like what I did the first time around. I'm just selecting certain areas that I feel, especially where there's darker value contrast, just needs extra emphasis. Back when I first painted this jug, I relied heavily on the pen to define shapes and edges. It wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was probably like a safety net. My watercolour skills were still developing and the pen gave me a sense of control, but over time I realised that actually the pen, although helpful, was holding me back, and it had become a bit of a crutch, stopping me from really learning how to let the watercolour shine on its own. And actually a few months after this first painting, I made a conscious decision to stop relying on pen work so much. I'm often asked why I paint first and then add line details if I do add line afterwards, and the answer is simple. It gives me room to interpret rather than feeling locked into a very tight literal representation from the start. With watercolour there's a lot of fluidity and unpredictability, and if I were to start with a pen, I think it would become too rigid, which would limit my creativity. Even after 10 years, I admit I don't know enough about colour theory to explain this to you, but I do know about cast shadows, and it is just a darker area created when a light hits an object and the object has blocked the light. In this example, the light is coming from slightly behind and to the right of the jug, so it is casting a shadow on the table in front and slightly to the left. And I tend to mix either a Payne's grey or a brown with a few other pigments depending on if I want a warm or a cooler shadow. And they are a great way to add contrast or the difference between light and dark, which helps your subject stand out. So they aren't just dark spots, they're an opportunity to make your painting a little bit more dynamic and exciting. So looking at this original jug from 10 years ago to how I paint it now, I think there are two things that are standing out for me. First of all, I have been able to preserve the luminosity by leaving some of the paper unpainted so that it glows. And the second one is not overworking it. I've learnt to trust the watercolour before it gets too fussy, and this looseness makes the painting feel much more fresher and vibrant. For this second version of the same jug, I am going to be using a watercolour base, but I'm going to be applying a bit of coloured pencil on top. This is a method that I use quite often these days and I really enjoy it, so let's see how this interpretation turns out. One thing I notice as an online teacher is that many students create just the one sketch of a subject, like a single flower, and then call it done. And while that is a great starting point, I always encourage them to take it further and say, imagine what you could learn if you sketch 3 or 4 flowers. And here's the thing, repetition is where some of the magic happens. When you revisit the same subject multiple times, you're giving yourself the chance to grow. The first attempt, like mine, might feel a little bit uncertain, but by the third or the fourth, you're going to find yourself working faster, making bolder decisions, and being able to refine your technique without thinking about it too much. And the other wonderful benefit of repetition is you are able to see the subject a lot more clearly. The better you understand its shape and its details and its character, and you start to notice things you missed before. Now we're moving on to the coloured pencil part. This is the Caran d'Ache Cerulean Brown, and I love using this shade in my work. I started using coloured pencils in my sketches about 3 years ago, and they add such a lovely textural line that really complements the watercolour beautifully. The way I apply it is actually quite similar to how I use the black fine liner. I focus on picking out areas of contrast, especially those with darker values where I want to add a bit more depth or definition. But what I really like about coloured pencil is how much more subtle it feels compared to the black line, creating something that's a little bit more natural and harmonious, whereas black can sometimes feel a little bit too harsh for me. At this stage, I've decided to just stop. I think the pencil has done its job. It's added enough texture and contrast to complement the watercolour When it came to adding the details of the ditzy florals, I realised I didn't have the exact shades of coloured pencil. The florals on the jug are quite pastel, but my coloured pencil tends to be a lot more moody, nature-inspired shades, and that's absolutely okay. As artists, we don't have to have the perfect tools or colours on hand. So part of this creative process that I'm learning, even for me at this stage, is making do with what we've got. In fact, I have found that working within limitations often leads to a lot more creative and interesting results. So I've just had to adjust my approach, choosing pencils that would still complement the overall palette of the piece and let the watercolour do a bit more of the talking. Sometimes not having the perfect tool pushes you to think differently and adapt, and that's again where some unexpected magic can happen. It's a good reminder that art isn't about having everything planned out perfectly. It's experimenting and problem solving and embracing those little surprises. Going back to what I said earlier about noticing more the second and third time round, this is such a big game changer, because with each repetition you start to see your subject in a slightly different way. I have developed a much better understanding of the areas of contrast in this jug, the places where the light and the dark meet, and because of this I feel a lot bolder when working in these areas. I don't hesitate to push the darker values or leave those lighter areas untouched, and that confidence allows me to make decisions that are a lot more intentional and impactful. One of the biggest advantages for me when working with coloured pencil on top of watercolour is the level of detail I can add. Honestly, I'm not very patient with a tiny brush, it just frustrates me, but with a coloured pencil I can quickly and easily add those ditzy florals and finishing touches without the fuss. If we compare the fine liner version I did earlier to this pencil version, the difference is quite noticeable. Although the techniques are similar in some ways, they both involve adding contrast and definition. The results do feel quite different. For the third and fourth version of this jug, I'm going to be using this Hahnemuhle 100% cotton sketchbook, and you can see that I've already pre-prepared the pages with textured backgrounds. I do have a YouTube video on this, which I will link in the description. For this third version, I am going to be using dip pen with ink. I've got Winsor & Newton Nut Brown, and this dip pen has the Browser Blue Pumpkin nib. Working on this third version, I can already see how much faster I'm able to get the shape down, and this is where repetition really starts to pay off. Every time you practice painting a shape, especially when working from life like this, your hand-eye coordination and muscle memory is going to improve significantly. When I first started sketching this jug, I had to think very carefully about every line and proportion and second-guessing myself. But now, after working through those earlier versions, my hands seem to know what to do much more instinctively. And it's not just about getting faster, it's about becoming more confident. And this confidence allows the process to feel a lot more natural, almost like a conversation between your eyes, your hand, and the subject in front of you. Every line of your dip pen or pencil, every stroke of your brush is like a rehearsal for the next version. Each mark builds on the last, making the process feel a lot more smoother and intuitive over time. What's exciting is this improvement doesn't just apply to a jug, it can apply to a landscape or florals, any other subject. Every time you repeat a shape, a stroke, a mark, you are training your brain and your hand to work together seamlessly. It's like building a foundation that supports all your future sketches and paintings. So next time you're tempted to move on after one attempt, remind yourself that each repetition is a chance to strengthen your skills. It's not just practice for this piece, it's an investment in everything you sketch or paint or draw in the future. This next part may shock some of the purists of watercolour. I am mixing white gouache with watercolour, but I needed something just a little bit more opaque. This is my sketchbook. I'm going to do what I want with it. I actually filmed and painted all of these in one afternoon, which is why you might notice the light changing. But honestly, I didn't even mind. I was in such a wonderful flow state that I just didn't want to stop. When you get into that rhythm where everything feels really natural, you're completely focused on this process, and it's really amazing experience. And that flow state is easier to achieve when you are familiar with your subject. By the third or fourth version, you've already worked through that initial awkwardness and your confidence starts to shine. You can stop second guessing every line or brushstroke and simply enjoy that act of creating. What's even better is that familiarity frees you up to experiment a little bit. You're no longer worried about getting it right because you've already worked through the foundational elements like the proportion and where the light is coming from. This is when you can start to play with a few new techniques, try different colour palettes. It's in these moments of experimentation that you often make the most exciting discoveries, not just about your subject, but also about your own creative potential. When you allow yourself to relax into the process, your work will feel lighter, more enjoyable, and for me, meditative. For version 4, I'm using Tombow markers, which are still quite new for me, but I was drawn to their warm neutral tones for this piece. I thought they would be really great for boosting the value contrast. You'll see what I mean in a little bit. What's exciting about working on a 4th version is how much more playful I feel. By this point, I have gotten very comfortable with the subject and I don't feel as cautious or controlling. And this is one of the things I love most about repetition. It really encourages exploration, but in a way that feels safe. Each version builds upon what you've already done, so you have that foundation, and that gives you the confidence to try something new, whether it is like a different material, like these markers, or a completely different technique. And it's through this process of experimenting, trying one approach and then another and then a different one, that you start to unlock greater creative freedom. You are no longer tied to just one way of doing things. And over time, your versatility as an artist is going to grow. In fact, I want to try this idea on something. I've been thinking of keeping just one sketchbook dedicated to a single subject matter, like apples, and I imagine filling this entire sketchbook with apples painted in all sorts of ways, loose watercolour, ink and wash, maybe coloured pencil and collage. It would be a playful way to explore and experiment, but also a brilliant way to learn. And that's the beauty of repetition. It's not just about the practicing, it is creating that space to grow and to find your own voice as an artist. If you're interested in working on textured backgrounds like I've done here with these two jugs, I do have a class called Expressive Sketches in Mixed Media, and I will include the link in the description below. Please check it out. Also let me know in the comments if you ever repeat a subject matter 2 or 3 times and how you feel about that. I also think it's important to talk about something that many of us feel these days. Social media can often make it look like an artist has created a beautiful artwork effortlessly, as if by magic. What we don't always see is the reality behind that moment, the hours, sometimes years of practice and repetition that artist has had to put in to get to that particular point. And what looks effortless is often the result of countless sketches, experiments, and probably a whole pile of mistakes. I think this can create a bit of a false sense of what's achievable, especially if you're just starting out or feeling stuck. It's easy to look at those finished pieces and think, why can't I do that? What's wrong with me? But the truth is, no one's art comes out perfectly formed on the first try. Working on these 4 sketches of the same jug has reminded me just how valuable repeating the same subject can be. With each version, I really did learn something new. The first sketch was all about figuring out the shape and the proportions and where the values were. By the second, I was more confident and started noticing more subtle details. By the third, I felt my hand-eye coordination kicking in, making the process a lot faster and intuitive. And with the fourth version, I had the freedom to experiment and play with a slightly different technique. What I've realised is that every attempt is like a rehearsal for the next. Repetition isn't just about practicing, it is about building confidence and growing as an artist. Giving yourself the space to experiment in a safe way where you're not focused on perfection but learning and enjoying that process. You might not know this, but I'm also a food illustrator for major brands and supermarkets, and that means I often have to draw things like pasta, cucumbers, or cheese over and over again to really understand them and to get them just right for my client. And that same idea applies to my sketchbook art too. Repetition isn't just about practicing, it's really about letting yourself explore, gaining that confidence and growing as an artist. This jug may be the subject, but the real takeaway is how much progress and creative freedom I have been able to achieve by letting myself stay with something for a little bit longer. So if you're feeling stuck, don't be afraid to revisit the same subject a few more times, and I think you are going to be surprised with what you discover.